Hey, in this video, I will examine, and I hope refute, the so-called die for a lie argument that many Christians offer in support of the claim that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. More specifically, that Jesus was raised from the dead bodily. Now, I realize there are some Christian sects who believe and teach that Jesus' resurrection was not physical. But even they say that Jesus took on a physical appearance after the resurrection, that the apostles weren't merely seeing a vision of a ghost of Jesus after he had been executed. In order to examine and refute an argument, one must first understand what the argument is and is not saying. In the instant case, I've looked to 3 Christian apologists to articulate the die for a lie argument for us: Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, and the late Jesuit Cardinal Avery Dulles. Let's listen to each of these men in turn.
Here were 12 men. 11 of the 12, or 10 of the 12, died martyrs' deaths. These were, most of them, writers of the New Testament or contributors to the New Testament. These are the men and women who were directly mentored by Jesus. They walked with him, they lived with him, they ate with him, they studied with him, both before and after the resurrection. They died martyrs' deaths or in exile for the conviction that Jesus Christ had been raised from the dead on the 3rd day, and they were willing to die for that. Now, there's usually 2 accusations that I hear when I make that statement. The first is this: well, Josh, a lot of people have died for a lie. And you know that's true. A lot of people have died for a lie. But when it comes to the New Testament, here is the problem. If the resurrection was a lie, if the resurrection did not happen, then here were 12 men who knew that it didn't happen. Now remember, they said in their own words that for 40 days they lived with Christ, and that he appeared to 500 people at one time after he was crucified and buried. If that was not true, then these 12 men had to know it wasn't true. Yes, a lot of people have died for a lie, but they thought it was the truth. And if the resurrection did not happen, the apostles had to know it. Therefore, you would have to say that these 12 men not only died for a lie, but they knew it was a lie. They went through the test of death to determine their veracity. And I believe that I can trust them. In fact, if I cannot trust them, then I cannot trust anyone historically.
But people will not die for their religious beliefs if they know their beliefs are false, right? I said, well, that's true. Nobody's going to die for a lie. I said, okay, then follow me on this. All of Christianity hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. If he came back from the dead, he is authenticating and proving his claim to being the Son of God. Everything hinges on that. The disciples in all of history were in a unique position. They didn't just believe sincerely that Jesus returned from the dead. They were in a position to know for a fact. They touched him. They ate with him. They talked with him. They knew this wasn't a trick or hallucination. They knew the truth. And knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. You see the difference? The fact that those terrorists were willing to die for it says nothing about the truth of Islam, does it? It just means they sincerely believe whatever it proclaims or whatever they interpret it as being. The disciples didn't just believe Jesus returned from the dead and thus proved he's the Son of God. They knew it for a fact. And knowing it for a fact, they were willing to die for it. Do you see the difference? I looked all throughout history. I couldn't find one example of anybody anywhere who knowingly and willingly died for a lie.
In an essay entitled The Rebirth of Apologetics, published in the May 2004 edition of the journal First Things, Cardinal Dulles wrote, quote, "From timid disciples anxiously bolting the doors of the upper room, they became apostles, openly proclaiming their faith at the risk of imprisonment, scourging, and martyrdom. No external opposition could keep them from speaking of what they had seen and heard. Seems to me that the elements of this argument can be set forth as follows. Number one, there was a group of people composed of sane, rational actors who, A, claimed that they had seen and interacted with a bodily resurrected Jesus sometime after he had been executed, and B, who preached a message that had as its centerpiece Jesus' resurrection. We'll talk specifically about who are and are not properly regarded as members of this group in a little bit. Number two, as the direct and exclusive result of their claim and their preaching this message, the members of this group of people were killed, martyred, often in exceedingly gruesome ways, but they went to their deaths willingly and without recanting. Number three, sane, rational actors do not willingly give up their lives for what they know to be false. Number four, since these people, sane, rational actors all, did willingly give up their lives as a direct and exclusive result of preaching the resurrection of Jesus, these people must have witnessed and interacted with a bodily resurrected Jesus. Number five, therefore, Jesus must have been raised from the dead. It's important to note that the argument is not proposing that the members of this group merely believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. It goes much farther than that. The argument proposes that these people witnessed and interacted with a physically resurrected Jesus. The proponents of this argument are quick to note, as you heard Messrs. McDowell and Strobel do, that there have been loads of people over the course of human history who were willing martyrs for their religious beliefs. The group of people referenced by the die for a lie argument was not composed of mere believers. Rather, it is claimed, the group was composed of eyewitnesses. As such, it's argued, the members of this group are different in kind from, for example, the 9/11 suicide hijackers who willingly got themselves killed for their religious beliefs, or suicide bombers, or any other person who dies for his or her religious beliefs. Okay, now that we have the argument down, let's move to the question of who should be considered part of the group of people referred to in the first element of the argument. In his book, More Than a Carpenter, Josh McDowell puts the following people in this group: Peter, Andrew, Matthew, John, James the son of Alphaeus, Philip, Simon, sometimes called Simon the Zealot, Thaddeus, James, brother of Jesus, Thomas, Bartholomew, and James, son of Zebedee. I'm willing to go with this list, but with a few caveats noted. And that's where I'll pick this up in part 2. See you there. Okay, continuing, we're looking at the list of names proposed by Josh McDowell in his book, More Than a Carpenter. And as I said in part 1, I'm willing to go with this list, but with a few caveats noted. Acts chapter 10, verses 40 to 41 suggests the criterion for membership in this group, the died for a lie group, or did they die for a lie group. It has Peter say, quote, God raised Jesus up on the third day and granted that he should become visible, not to all people, but to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God. That is, to us who ate and drank with Jesus after he arose from the dead. Now, this group should be easy enough to identify, but here's where we begin to see the complications and inconsistencies and other problems that plague this argument start to emerge. So caveat A, it seems that Matthias should be on this list. Acts 1, 21 to 22 identifies Matthias as one of the men who had accompanied the apostles throughout the time Jesus was with them, and it also identifies him as a witness of the resurrection. He was selected, as most of you no doubt know, to fill the place once held by Judas Iscariot among the 12 apostles. However, Acts 1:22-26 constitutes the only mention of Matthias in all of Christian scripture. Subsequent Christian tradition or legend is divided about the circumstances of Matthias's death. It is variously claimed that Matthias died of natural causes in Jerusalem, was crucified in a part of what is now the Republic of Georgia, or was crucified in Ethiopia, or was stoned in Jerusalem but survived the stoning, only to end up being beheaded later on. In short, we don't know why, how, or when Matthias died. At best, this says nothing for or against the apostles wouldn't die for a lie argument. At worst, it militates against the argument, begins to bring into relief a problem that continually plagues this argument, as we will see, and that is, we don't really know what happened to the vast majority of these people. So we're not going to include Matthias on the list, but his inclusion wouldn't help this argument. In fact, it would hurt it, and I suspect that's why Matthias tends not to show up on these lists. Okay, caveat B, with respect to eating and drinking with Jesus after the resurrection, I'm compelled to ask, what about Nathanael of Cana? The 21st chapter of John's Gospel describes what's called, quote, the third time that Jesus was manifested or made visible to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. The risen Jesus is portrayed by John as cooking breakfast for the disciples on a beach at the Sea of Galilee. 7 of the disciples encounter the breakfast-making Jesus on the beach, including one called Nathanael of Cana. The Gospel of John is the only one of the 4 canonical Gospels that mentions Nathanael of Cana. Apologists and others have attempted to solve the problem by claiming that Bartholomew, whose name appears on the list of apostles' names in each of the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, had another name. Guess which name they said Bartholomew had? Nathanael of Cana, come on down. Nathanael, of course. For example, in the Saints and Angels section of the website Catholics Online, it is asserted, quote, Saint Nathanael is Saint Bartholomew. Nice how that works, huh? It's also worth noting that according to John's Gospel, when Nathanael first met Jesus, Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Now, the Jesus of John's Gospel isn't even remotely as impressed or enthused by this as the Jesus of Matthew's Gospel is, when Peter declares that Jesus is the Son of God at a much later period in Jesus' ministry, but that's a matter for another video. The bottom line is that Christian tradition or legend merely asserts that Bartholomew and Nathanael of Cana are the same person. For the sake of time, I'll accede to legend or tradition by placing Nathanael's name next to Bartholomew's on our list. This brings to the foreground the fact that the 4 canonical Gospels and the book of Acts don't always agree on the names of the apostles. For example, in addition to the Bartholomew-Nathanael discrepancy, there is the Thaddeus-Judas discrepancy. Gospels of Mark and Matthew each list someone called Thaddeus among the 12 apostles, but have only one Judas, namely Judas Iscariot. The listings in Luke and Acts do not include Thaddeus, but do include someone called Judas, son of James, in addition to Judas Iscariot. John's Gospel, which never mentions the names of all 12 apostles, refers to someone called Judas, quote, not Iscariot. You won't be surprised to discover that the Christian tradition or legend works its assertive magic on this discrepancy too, For example, the Saints and Angels section of Catholic Online simply asserts that Judas, or Jude, was, quote, known as Thaddeus. Of course, nowhere in the Gospels or elsewhere in the Christian scriptures does anything indicate that Judas, son of James, or more correctly from Greek, Judas of James, was known as Thaddeus. But if one learns anything from the way that Christian apologists tend to deal with contradictions among their sacred texts, it is that they are ready, willing, and able to ignore what the text does or does not say in favor of fiating contradictions out of existence. The Bartholomew-Nathaniel discrepancy, the Thaddeus-Judas discrepancy are but two examples of this sort of bullshit at work. And I'm using bullshit in the sense discussed in Harry G. Frankfurt's excellent book on bullshit. All right, caveat C. What about Cleopas and his unnamed fellow disciple? In the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel, we encounter a follower of Jesus named Cleopas, who, we're told, on the Sunday after Jesus had been executed, was traveling with another follower of Jesus to the village of Emmaus. The story says that Jesus came along and joined Cleopas and his traveling companion on the road, but, quote, their eyes were prevented from recognizing Jesus. After they conversed for a while on the road, the narrative of the conversation is problematic for a number of reasons, all of which are beyond the scope of this video. Cleopas and his traveling companion importune Jesus to stay with them through the evening. As they prepare to have dinner, Jesus breaks and blesses some bread, and voila! The eyes of Cleopas and his traveling companion are opened, and they recognize that they've been with the risen Jesus all along. Whereupon, quote, Jesus vanished from their sight. Cleopas and his traveling companion hightail it back to Jerusalem to tell the 11 remaining apostles about their encounter with the risen Jesus. And while they were in the middle of the story, according to Luke, Jesus appeared again. After assuring all of them that he wasn't a ghost, Jesus requested and ate a piece of broiled fish. So it seems Cleopas and his unnamed fellow disciple should be included on the list. After all, according to one gospel, they twice witnessed the risen Jesus appearing and had 2 post-resurrection food events with him. However, there's no mention of Cleopas anywhere else in Luke or the rest of the Christian scriptures. No one knows what became of him. Most relevant here is that the circumstances of his death and the death of his fellow disciple are unknown. What is true of Cleopas and his unnamed fellow disciple is true of many of those who the Christian scriptures claim saw and interacted with the risen Jesus. We know nothing, or next to nothing about them. The circumstances of their deaths are unknown. We have no idea whether they faced persecution, much less martyrdom. All right, on to part 3. Okay, continuing. Josh McDowell's list and other lists include James, the brother of Jesus, in the group of apostles who, it is claimed, would not have died for a lie. Of course, if the Gospels are to be believed, Jesus' brother James was not among Jesus' 12 apostles, nor was he among the larger group of people who followed Jesus during his lifetime. In fact, the Gospels repeatedly say that Jesus' brothers in particular and his family in general didn't believe in him. For example, John 7:5 says, even his own brothers did not believe in him. According to the Gospel of Mark, in the wake of Jesus taking to a mountaintop to select apostles who would, among other things, quote, have authority to expel demons, Jesus' family showed up to collect him because they feared he'd gone. Mark 3:21, when his family heard of this, they came to take charge of him, saying, he is out of his mind. What an exceedingly odd thing for a family that would have known the highly unusual circumstances of Jesus' birth, what angels had told Mary and Joseph about who Jesus was, and the rest. But I digress. None of the Gospels, or any New Testament text for that matter, describes a scene in which James converts to faith in his brother Jesus. James is not present in any of the post-resurrection eating and drinking scenes with the apostles. Paul alone claims that the risen Jesus, quote, appeared to James. No details of the appearance are provided. It's worth noting that if the Gospel of Matthew is to be believed, merely seeing the risen Jesus wasn't enough by itself to inspire faith. Matthew describes a scene in which the risen Jesus appears to and speaks with the 11 apostles on the top of a mountain. According to Matthew 28:17, while all of this was going on, quote, some doubted. So seeing Jesus alive after his execution didn't always do the trick, at least according to Matthew. In any case, in one of the earliest of the canonical Christian writings, namely Paul's letter to the Galatians, James, the brother of Jesus, is described as an apostle and as one of the pillars of the early church. I suspect the primary reason James, the brother of Jesus, shows up on the list of apostles who wouldn't have died for a lie is because Christian apologists believe that James' martyrdom is attested to by a non-Christian historian. We'll explore that problematic belief a bit later. Caveat E.
Tell me where in the world is
The Apostle Paul? Josh McDowell's list does not include Paul, nor does the vast majority of lists I looked at in preparing for this series. Why? Well, it seems Paul's purported encounters with the risen Jesus do not satisfy the criteria for inclusion in the wouldn't die for a lie group. Let's listen to Lee Strobel's description once more.
The disciples in all of history were in a unique position. They didn't just believe sincerely that Jesus returned from the dead. They were in a position to know for a fact. They touched him. They ate with him. They talked with him. They knew this wasn't a trick or hallucination. They knew the truth. And knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it.
As Acts 10:41 says, when we're talking about this group, we're talking about those, quote, who ate and drank with Jesus after he arose from the dead. Those who, it is claimed, saw and interacted with a physically resurrected Jesus. What does the Bible claim Paul saw? Well, in the 9th chapter of Acts, Paul's encounter with Jesus is described as follows, quote, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice. Acts has Paul describe the scene twice more. While the subsequent accounts, particularly the last of them, seem embellished, they contain the same basics about what Paul purportedly saw. Acts 22:6-11 has Paul say, quote, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice. He goes on to say, quote, I could not see because of the brightness of that light. Acts 26:13-19 has Paul say he saw, quote, a light from heaven brighter than the sun shining all around me, and I heard a voice. The passage has Paul add for the first time that Jesus spoke to him, quote, in the Hebrew dialect. Some translations have it as Aramaic, others as the Hebrew language. Anyway, in verse 19, Paul calls the whole thing a, quote, heavenly vision. There are no indicia of Paul having the sort of physical encounter with the risen Jesus that the Gospels and Acts describe the 11 remaining apostles having with the risen Jesus. No eating, drinking, touching, and the rest. Therefore, Paul is not on the list. By the way, according to Acts, Paul experienced a number of visions of Jesus. My personal favorite is in Acts 22:17-18, which says Paul was praying in the temple in Jerusalem, and he, quote, fell into a trance, unquote, and saw Jesus speaking to him. No doubt Christians would quickly dismiss as silly talk of trances and visions from a non-Christian religious figure, but they enthusiastically embrace the very same thing from prominent figures in their own faith tradition. Caveat F, F for finally. Finally, I must mention the various women who purportedly saw and interacted with physically resurrected Jesus. We know nothing about the circumstances of their deaths, so they're not included here. Okay, so we have our list of people who, it is claimed, would not have died for a lie. Let's get to work on it. There are at least 3 problems with the "they wouldn't die for a lie" argument. Number one, the argument ignores the tremendous and demonstrated power of cognitive or psychological dissonance management among religious believers. Number two, the argument doesn't seem to be rooted in or consistent with Christian scriptures. Number three, the argument has little, if any, meaningful evidence to support it. I'll take each of these in turn. Okay, point number one, the argument ignores the tremendous and demonstrated power of cognitive dissonance management among religious believers. After over half a century of research and study, one of the best established facts about religious believers is that when they experience a disappointment with respect to their religious beliefs, especially, ironically enough, a significant disappointment, for example, the failure of a major prophecy, believers tend to be driven to neutralize the cognitive or psychological dissonance caused by such a disappointment and find a means of reestablishing cognitive consonance without sacrificing their religious beliefs. There's a ton of literature on this, but the best I've seen is an article entitled "When Prophecy Fails and Faith Persists," a theoretical overview, written by sociologist Lorne L. Dawson of the University of Waterloo in Canada. The article was published in 1999 and is now available online for free. There's a link to the right of the screen for those interested. I strongly encourage anyone watching this to read the article. One sees the phenomenon play out over and over again in religious contexts. For example, the significant prophetic failures of Jehovah's Witnesses in 1914, 1925, and 1975 did not destroy the organization. There are still millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world, including people who witnessed the prophetic failures. Believers successfully navigated the disconfirmation by finding ways to reestablish cognitive consonance without sacrificing their religious beliefs. Lubavitch Hasidim puked and rallied when their Rebbe Menachem Schneerson, believed by many to be the Messiah, died in 1994. It remains one of the largest and most vibrant Hasidic sects, and a significant number of its adherents still hail the late Rabbi Schneerson as the Messiah and await his return to earth. Believers successfully navigated the disconfirmation by finding ways to reestablish cognitive consonance without sacrificing their religious beliefs. Okay, I'll pick this up in part 4. Okay, continuing. Unfulfilled apocalyptic expectations failed to destroy early Christianity, which gradually reinterpreted the apocalyptic elements of its emerging belief system. Believers successfully navigated the disconfirmation, that is, Jesus did not come back, by finding ways to reestablish cognitive consonance without sacrificing their religious beliefs. Given the staggering consistency of this phenomenon, with disappointed religious sect after disappointed religious sect working to turn some major defeat into victory, it seems quite likely that Jesus' earliest followers, the core of true believers who were as deeply invested in their beliefs as generations of religious adherents before and after them, people who had given up so much to follow Jesus, were not going to allow themselves to be stopped by Jesus' brutal execution and death as a political criminal. They successfully navigated the disconfirmation that was Jesus' execution by finding ways to reestablish cognitive consonance without sacrificing their religious beliefs. Among the ways they did this, and according to Dr. Dawson, it's one of the most common modes of dissonance management, was to deny failure. Jesus wasn't defeated by death, but rather God made him victorious over it. Of course, the details of what came to be regarded as Jesus' God-given victory over death developed significantly over time. One need only read the Christian scriptures to see this development play out. In the early stages, the victorious Jesus, quote, became a life-giving spirit. He was the one who was, quote, revealed in the flesh and vindicated in the spirit. He was, quote, put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. He was, quote, great high priest who was passed through the heavens. Later on, as the tradition evolved, the victorious Jesus was depicted as possessing a fish-eating body of, quote, flesh and bone. While early in the tradition, believers are told that what emerges at the resurrection is not the body that was buried, later on, the tradition depicts Jesus victorious over death in the same body in which he had been killed. It even retains the scars of crucifixion, scars that admit of physical examination. Additionally, research shows that religious believers who have employed various dissonance management strategies to deal with significant disconfirmation of their beliefs often work harder and feel more united with one another. Moreover, persecution serves to increase their sense of unity, even persecution that results in the death, the martyrdom, of some members. Are such believers being persecuted and even dying for a lie? They do not believe they are. And so, even if every one of the people on our list was persecuted and killed for believing and teaching that Jesus had been raised from the dead, that would prove nothing about whether, as a matter of fact, Jesus was physically resurrected several days after being executed. It merely tells us that these people had come to believe that Jesus was victorious over death. They believed it was true, and they regarded this belief as important enough to die for. Among religious believers, the management of cognitive dissonance is an extremely powerful thing, and the earliest followers of Jesus were not immune to it. In other words, they were not unique. Okay, I'll pick this up in part 5. Okay, continuing. Now, before moving on to the second problem with the wouldn't die for a lie argument, I want to make one more point about how the details of Jesus' victory over death developed in Christian tradition over time. In the entire New Testament, there is only one first-person autobiographical account of Jesus appearing to someone after Jesus' execution, namely Paul's own description of his encounter with Jesus, which appears in the first chapter of Galatians. Paul says that God, quote, was pleased to reveal his Son in me. This was Paul's, quote, revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul describes his experience as an internal revelation, an apocalypto. He never talks about this whole seeing a light and hearing a voice thing that appears in Acts. Bit further down the line in the Pauline corpus, in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8, Paul offers an enumeration of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances or seeings, sightings, which he refers to as visions, using the same Greek word that is used, for example, to describe Peter, James, and John's vision of Moses and Elijah at Jesus' transfiguration, Paul's vision of a Macedonian man in Acts 16:9, and the author of Revelation's vision of a 7-headed red dragon in the sky with 10 horns. After this, the Christian scriptures are devoid of any autobiographical accounts of Jesus' post-mortem appearances. Paul says he's the last. And the details of these appearances then begin to become more elaborate and increasingly expressed in physical terms. So, the wouldn't die for a lie argument ignores the tremendous and demonstrated power of cognitive dissonance management among religious believers. Let's move on to the second problem with the wouldn't die for a lie argument. Number 2, the argument does not seem to be rooted in or consistent with the Christian scriptures. I'm going to offer 2 points here. The first is that the Christian scriptures don't seem to support the proposition that it was Jesus' resurrection that got the apostles up and out preaching about Jesus and willing to face persecution and even death. In fact, as I noted earlier in this series, according to the Gospel of Matthew, seeing and interacting with the risen Jesus wasn't even enough to inspire faith among all 11 of the remaining apostles, much less preaching about Jesus' resurrection. See my earlier discussion of Matthew 28:16-17. In Mark's Gospel, news of the resurrection inspires fear, trembling, and silence. In the Gospel of Luke, after interacting with the risen Jesus and watching him depart from them, by the way, isn't it interesting that the Jesus of Luke's Gospel departs from the apostles on the evening of the day he was raised from the dead? The text is not exactly clear as to precisely how Jesus departs, but the Jesus of Acts, a text written by the same author, hangs around for, quote, 40 days before departing. In any case, in Luke, after interacting with the risen Jesus and watching him depart from them, the apostles spend their time, quote, in the temple, praising God. They're not out in the streets of Jerusalem telling people about the risen Jesus. In John's Gospel, after the apostles interact with the risen Jesus on several occasions, they are then depicted going back to fishing up in Galilee. The Acts of the Apostles is to be believed. It is the apostles receiving the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, described in the 2nd chapter of Acts, that sends the apostles out into the streets to preach about Jesus, not their having seen and interacted with the risen Jesus. It's worth noting that the Gospel of John tells a different story, a very different story, about how the apostles received the Holy Spirit. Specifically, according to John, the apostles received the Holy Spirit from Jesus breathing on them on the evening of the day he had arisen from the dead. One should think that the New Testament writers would have gotten the story straight, especially since they were, it is claimed, writing under divine inspiration. But I digress. For purposes of our discussion here, the important thing is that the Christian scriptures seem to insist that it was a dramatic conversion experience that impelled the people on our list, not their seeing and interacting with a physically resurrected Jesus. The second point, the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, depict the death of only one of the 12 people whose names appear on our list, namely James, son of Zebedee. James's execution does not comport with the details of the wouldn't die for a lie argument. The 12th chapter of Acts tells the story in an almost by-the-way fashion. Acts 12:1 says that Herod, that's Herod Agrippa I, who was called, among other things, King of the Jews, decided to oppress the church. Acts 12:2 says, quote, "And Herod had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword." Acts 12:3 tells us that this action, quote, "pleased the Jews." That's it. There's nothing here about James being killed because he preached that Jesus had been raised from the dead. There's nothing here about Herod Agrippa giving James an opportunity to recant in order to avoid being killed. There's nothing indicating that James even had a chance to speak before the sword took his life. As written, the story is consistent with James being dispatched very quickly without any formal legal proceedings, for example, a trial. Moreover, the story is consistent with the proposition that Herod Agrippa decided to go after Christians for purely political reasons, not theological reasons. As noted earlier, one of Agrippa's titles, bestowed on him by Rome, was King of the Jews. Now, he had Christians in his jurisdiction who were advocating membership in a group founded by, or at least dedicated to, a man, namely Jesus, who was executed on the charge that he had claimed to be King of the Jews. Monarchs rarely, if ever, tolerate rivals. Moreover, Agrippa was among Rome's chief local collaborators in the region. He had imperial masters to keep satisfied. The Roman authorities would likely have taken a very dim view of Agrippa permitting a movement dedicated to what they viewed as a pretender to authority to survive and thrive under his watch. So the story of James, son of Zebedee, being summarily executed, the only story in the entire New Testament pertaining to how someone on our list met his death, does not comport with the wouldn't die for a lie argument. We need to cross James, son of Zebedee, off our list. He doesn't help the apologist argument here. Next is the third problem with the argument, namely it has little, if any, meaningful evidence to support it. And I'll pick that up in part 6. Okay, continuing. The third problem with the wouldn't die for a lie argument is that it has little, if any, meaningful evidence to support it. This is the most complex of the argument's three problems, and, not surprisingly, the one Christian apologists tend to skip by as quickly as possible. It'll take some time to discuss. As I noted in part 5 of this series, the Christian scriptures depict the death of only one of the 12 people whose names appear on our list, namely James, son of Zebedee, in Acts 12, 1-3. That story does not comport with the wouldn't die for a lie argument. After this, the Christian tradition fell silent as to the fate of the rest of the people on our list, a silence that persisted for a very long time, in most cases for several centuries. Stephen Gertz, one of Christianity Today's history editors, puts the best face on it for believers. Quote, "The tradition of apostles' martyrdom goes back at least to the beginning of the 3rd century CE. Perhaps most devastating to the wouldn't die for a lie argument is the fact that when the tradition speaks again, it does so in divergent voices and in a hopelessly muddled, contradictory, and dubious fashion that substantially diminishes the argument's persuasiveness. For example, take the Apostle John, the brother of James, son of Zebedee. The Christian tradition's majority report is that John was not a martyr, died of natural causes. If true, we must cross John's name off our list. There is a minority report in Christian tradition that, relying in part on passages such as Matthew 20, 20-23, claims that John must have died a martyr's death, and a gruesomely violent one at that. Otherwise, Jesus will have been proven wrong. Jesus being wrong, of course, raises the Deuteronomy 18:22 problem. If a prophet speaking in God's name predicts something that does not come true, then the prophet wasn't really speaking for God, and therefore should be ignored. Matthew 20, 20-23 portrays John and James's mother coming to Jesus to request prominent positions for her sons. She says to Jesus, "Command that in your kingdom these 2 sons of mine may sit, one on your right and one on your left." Can't blame a mother for trying to get some choice spots for her boys, right? Jesus asks John and James, "Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" The cup I am about to drink is generally regarded as a reference to Jesus' imminent execution. See, for example, Matthew 26:39, which has Jesus praying just prior to his arrest, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." John and James declare that they're prepared to drink from the cup, from the metaphorical cup, to which Jesus replies, "My cup you shall drink." The Greek text has Jesus saying that they shall surely or certainly drink from this cup. And since there's no question about what the metaphorical cup is, it seems Jesus must be saying that it's certain that James and John will be violently executed. If, however, the majority of Christian tradition is correct in saying that John was not a martyr, that he died of natural causes, then Jesus was wrong here. Or to put it more positively, Jesus was only half right. James was violently executed, but John was not. It's no wonder that the Christian apologetic website gotquestions.org declares, quote, "It's not so important how the apostles died. What is important is the fact that they were all willing to die for their faith." So much for the wouldn't die for a lie argument, huh? It's worth noting that Jesus being wrong is only one of several problems plaguing Matthew 20:20-23. For example, while the author of Matthew has James and John's mother coming to Jesus to make the request for prime seats in the kingdom, the parallel and earlier version of this story in Mark 10:35-40 has James and John themselves, not their mother, making the request, which, if either of the gospel writers is correct here, the author of Matthew or the author of Mark? Well, that's a question for another day. The important thing for us here is that in the main, Christian tradition holds that John did not die a martyr's death. Jesus' prediction to the contrary notwithstanding, we cross John off our list and note the lack of supporting evidence for the wouldn't die for a lie argument here. Finally, one more thing with respect to John. There is a line of Christian tradition that claims there was an attempt to martyr John, specifically that the Emperor Domitian ordered John to be boiled to death in a cauldron of bubbling oil. In Rome, there's a lovely church called San Giovanni a Porta Latina, St. John at the Latin Gate, which, it is said, was built on the site of the boiling. Adjacent to the church is a chapel called San Giovanni in Olio, St. John in oil, in which there is this fresco depicting John being lowered into the cauldron of boiling oil. According to the tale, John survived the attempted boiling. He was even refreshed by it. How anyone can see history in such things rather than hagiographic legend is beyond me. After the boiling failed, Domitian exiled John to the island of Patmos. Yet another line of Christian tradition claims that it was Nero, not Domitian, who exiled John to Patmos approximately 30 years earlier. As I said, Christian tradition speaks in divergent voices and in a hopelessly muddled, contradictory, and dubious fashion. What about James, brother of Jesus? In his case, many Christian apologists claim they have a non-Christian historian on their side, namely Josephus, in whose Jewish antiquities, apologists claim, the martyrdom of James, brother of Jesus, is attested to and described. Let's have a look. In Book 20, Chapter 9, Paragraph 1 of his Antiquities, Josephus tells a story about an ugly turn in a rivalry regarding the Jewish high priesthood. This took place during the time between the death of Festus, the Roman procurator in Judea from 59 to 62 CE, and the arrival in Judea of his successor. So it was 62 CE. An audacious and severe Sadducee called Ananus was appointed high priest, and he viewed the absence of a Roman governor on the ground as an opportunity to flex some muscle. So he assembled a Sanhedrin of judges, and Josephus writes, quote, brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. Josephus reports that Ananus, quote, formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, unquote, and, quote, delivered them to be stoned. The local population was unhappy about this. Josephus reports, quote, "It was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without the Roman procurator's consent." The Jewish high priest and other temple authorities were both under Roman rule as well as Rome's local collaborators in the governing of Judea. Ultimately, Ananus was removed from the office of high priest, replaced by someone called Jesus, the son of Domnius. Among Jewish high priests in the Second Temple era, the name Jesus appears with some frequency. Jesus, the son of Domnius, is the one who interests us here. So, does Josephus describe the martyrdom of Jesus' brother James? Well, the best answer to this question is probably not. Some argue that the words "who was called Christ" constitute a later Christian addition to the text, and while that's possible, a solid case for interpolation has not yet been made. Moreover, it's not necessary for three related reasons. Number one, the story makes at least as much sense, probably more, if we regard this James to have been the brother of Jesus, the son of Domnius, the one who ended up being appointed high priest. And I'll pick it up there in part 7. Okay, continuing. So the story makes at least as much sense, probably more, if we regard this James to have been the brother of Jesus, son of Domnius, the one who ended up being appointed high priest. Christ comes to us from the Greek word Christos, which means anointed. The Jewish high priest is often called the anointed, as Josephus, a Jew, would have known. See, for example, Leviticus 4, verse 5, where the high priest is called, quote, the anointed priest. In Hebrew, Mashiach, Messiah, the anointed one. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, it's Christos. The high priest is called Mashiach or Christos 4 times in Leviticus. Numbers 35:25 speaks of, quote, the high priest being anointed, Mashach, with the holy oil. So it may well be that this James, whom Ananus had stoned, was the brother of Jesus, son of Domnius, who was the anointed, the Christos, because he was appointed high priest in place of the unlawful Ananus. Second, if Josephus' story were about James, brother of Jesus of Nazareth, it's not readily apparent why the local population would have been so upset by the stoning of members of the heretical and politically troubling Jesus sect that they would have protested both to the king and the new Roman procurator in Judea, protests that, at least in part, led to Ananus's being removed from office. The hastily and unlawfully arranged killing of the brother of a high priestly rival and some of his associates seems a far more likely cause of popular outrage. Third, Christian tradition's story about the martyrdom of James, brother of Jesus, is substantially different from the story in Josephus. In Book 2, Chapter 23 of his Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century, but relying on earlier Christian claims, says there was a Jewish plot against Christians that came to focus on James, brother of Jesus, because, quote, the Jews were frustrated in their hope of entrapping Paul by the snares which they had laid for him. Moreover, there was, quote, commotion among the Jews, because so many, even among the rulers, were coming to believe in Jesus. According to the story, the scribes and Pharisees convinced James to go up to, quote, the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem at Passover time. The scribes and Pharisees yelled up to James, basically asking him to tell the people that they should not believe in Jesus. No surprise, James does exactly the opposite, which leads to even more people converting to faith in Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees realize that their little plan sucked, so they scramble up to the pinnacle of the temple to throw James off. Guess what? James survives the fall to the ground. Now, I have to pause here for a second to say that it's a leitmotif in these apostolic martyrdom legends that you just can't kill these guys. Boil them in oil, they survive. Throw them off high buildings, they're fine. Crucify them, and they will continue to live for days, lecturing people from the cross, and so it goes on. Poor Jesus seems an easy mark by comparison. When they got him, they got him. But according to Christian tradition, his followers were the religious equivalent of Timex watches.
Now we have attached a Timex Marlin to the arrowhead, and we're going to ask Bill Brining to give us a demonstration. Gentlemen, you can see for yourself. There, you see that second hand going around? We have attached the Timex Marlin watch to a ring on the front of the Espadon. All right, let's see how our Timex does in that rough surf. Okay, let's see how our Timex did. There, it's still going. I'm going to attach this Timex Ladies Waterproof inside this KitchenAid automatic dishwasher. Look at those powerful jets of water hit that watch. You can see it swinging in there. Let's see how our Ladies Waterproof took that beating. Yes, I'm told you can hear it, so you know it's still ticking. We've attached the Timex water-resistant watch to his skate. Now let's take a look at that watch. See the sweep second hand going? We've strapped a Timex 100 to the propeller of this motor. It can stand up to anything that will happen in daily wear. Pull it right out now, will you? Let's take a look. Yes, it's still ticking.
Since James survived being thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, the scribes and Pharisees began stoning him. But he continued to live, so one of them took a club and hit James over the head with it. That did the trick. And thus he suffered martyrdom, Eusebius declares. There's nothing about the Sadducee high priest Ananus in this tale, nothing about any companions of James's being arrested, nothing about the Sanhedrin, nothing about a rivalry for the high priesthood. In short, on significant details, this is about as different from Josephus's story as it can be. Yet Eusebius, one in a long line of Christian apologists with balls the size of the Rock of Gibraltar, links his martyrdom legend to Josephus's story about James, the brother of Jesus, the son of Domnius. Christian apologists have been doing it ever since. Don't buy it. In sum, all we have on James, brother of Jesus, is an astoundingly fantastic pious legend. Even theologian William Barclay was compelled to concede in his Barclay's Guide to the New Testament that, quote, much in the story may well be legendary. Barclay even points out that the story in Eusebius dates the events differently, placing them at least 4 years later than Josephus's story. Cross James, brother of Jesus, off the list. We don't know what happened to him. What about Andrew? Christian apologists claim that he was crucified in Greece on an X-shaped cross. The basis for this claim appears to be the apocryphal 3rd century work called The Acts of Andrew, which says that Andrew was tortured and later crucified not because of his message about Jesus' resurrection, but rather because he had converted the local Roman proconsul's fiancée to Christianity, and after her conversion, she sought to sever the relationship. This angered the proconsul greatly, and he had Andrew arrested and eventually ordered him executed. Cross Andrew off the list. It's worth noting that the jealous husband or jealous lover thing comes up with some frequency in the apostolic martyrdom legends. What about Matthew? Christian tradition is divided as to whether Matthew even was a martyr or died of natural causes. According to Clement of Alexandria, Matthew died an old man in or about 90 CE. If true, cross his name off our list. The tradition that Matthew was martyred is hopelessly divided, with contradictory claims as to where he was killed. Some say Ethiopia, others Macedonia, others Parthia, others on his way to India, and how he was killed. Some say he was stabbed, others say he was beheaded, others say he was stoned, yet others say he was crucified and then set on fire. As noted earlier, these stories often include multiple attempts to kill. Bottom line, there is no conclusive evidence as to whether Matthew died as a martyr, much less for how, when, and under what circumstances he might have been killed. Simply put, there's no meaningful evidence for the wouldn't die for a lie argument here. Cross Matthew's name off the list. What about Bartholomew/Nathaniel? Again, the Christian tradition is divided. Some say he was beaten and then crucified. Others claim he was beheaded. Still others claim he was flayed, that is, skinned. And even those who say he was skinned can't agree on the details. Was it with a whip? Was it with a knife? Michelangelo was partial to the flaying story in his great fresco The Last Judgment, which is on the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. Bartholomew/Nathaniel is portrayed holding his skin and the knife with which it was removed. However, yet again, we see the Christian tradition speaking in divergent voices and in a hopelessly muddled, contradictory fashion. There's no meaningful evidence for the wouldn't die for a lie argument here. Cross Nathaniel/Bartholomew's name off the list. I'll pick this up in Part 8, the last part and the briefest part of this series. Thanks. Okay, finally, according to Christian tradition, the Apostle Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. However, there's virtually no evidence that Peter ever went to Rome. Moreover, Peter's crucifixion purportedly took place during Nero's persecution of Christians, which had nothing to do with theology, but was an attempt by Nero to scapegoat Christians for the massive Roman fire that Nero himself had caused. If Peter was executed in that roundup, then he did die for a lie, only it was Nero's lie, and had nothing to do with whether Jesus was raised from the dead or not. Cross Peter's name off the list. 7 of the 12 people whose names appear on our list have proven to provide no support for the wouldn't die for a lie argument. I could go through the remaining 5 names, but I can assure you that they don't serve the argument any better. The bottom line is that the argument has little, if any, meaningful evidence to support it. The wouldn't die for a lie argument is plagued by at least these 3 problems, and therefore is useless as an argument to support the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. Thanks very much.